You know, sometimes you come across a view of history that, well, it suggests there's something else going on, doesn't it? A kind of hidden hand, maybe, a long influence working under the surface.
Hmm.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into some really fascinating and sometimes pretty startling material that one of you shared with us. These sources talk about this continuous, centuries-long conspiracy against the United States.
Right. And the main players identified in these documents are the Holy Alliance from Europe,
Hmm?
and specifically the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits.
Exactly. So our mission today, using the documents you sent, congressional records, books by historical figures, critics, even some modern analyses, is to unpack these
We'll
claims.
try to map out who they say was involved, the key events, and what the alleged motivations were for this supposed ongoing attack on American liberty and the Constitution.
It's quite a mix of sources covering a lot of ground, so let's get into it. Okay, starting point.
Yeah.
After 1815, Europe, the Holy Alliance.
Right. So post-Napoleon, you have these powerful European monarchies forming this alliance. And their goal, pretty openly, was to suppress popular governments, revolutions, republics, keep the old order.
And your sources link this directly to America. They cite Senator Robert L. Owen speaking in Congress in 1916.
Yeah, he apparently warned that this Holy Alliance was specifically targeting American republics, trying to undermine them.
Okay. And how did the Jesuits come into this picture so early, according to the material?
Well, the sources connected immediately. They quote R.W. Thompson. He was Secretary of the Navy, later on writing in 1894.
What did he say?
He apparently claimed that these European monarchs chose the Jesuits as their main instrument, their agents to weaken the U.S.
Chosen specifically. Wow.
And they even bring in Pope Pius VII, suggesting he wanted to use the Jesuits, who he'd recently revived, for this exact purpose.
Okay, so it wasn't just Thompson thinking this way.
Apparently not. Samuel B. Morse, yes, the Morse code inventor, is cited as saying similar things way back in 1835.
Really?
Yeah. He thought Prince Metternich of Austria knew a direct military attack wouldn't work. So the plan B, according to Morse as presented here, was to destabilize America from within,
Wow.
using, and this is his phrase apparently, an army of Jesuits.
An army of Jesuits.
Ah,
That's strong language.
it is. And this really sets the foundation in these sources for this idea of a constant hidden assault by the Jesuits against America, kicking off right around 1815.
A sort of continuous secret war.
That's the narrative presented, yes.
Yeah.
Which leads to the next big question these sources tackle. Okay, who are these Jesuits, according to this view? What's their nature?
Well, the picture painted is very specific. They're described as deeply secretive, no outward badge, blending in, able to be anyone.
Right. They quote E.G. White quite a bit here.
Uh-huh. She wrote about their alleged methods,
Yeah.
using disguises, getting into government offices, shaping education.
And that famous or infamous principle, the end justifies the means.
That seems key in these texts,
Yeah.
that they'd be willing to do, well, almost anything.
Exactly. The sources quote White, suggesting they justify lying, stealing, even perjury or assassination if it served the church's goals. It's a picture of an organization deeply embedded, but with a hidden, potentially ruthless agenda.
And the timing, again, the Pope brings the order back in 1815, specifically, these sources say, to fight against democratic liberty.
Yes. They compare them to something like a Masonic order, but then say they're 1,000 times more dangerous.
Because they're supposedly everywhere. Merchants, lawyers, writers.
All working secretly for the same goal. That's the claim. And the sources stress their alleged oath of absolute obedience. Meaning they supposedly vow to follow orders from their superiors without question, instantly, go anywhere, do anything commanded. This complete obedience and secrecy is framed as central to the threat they pose.
Okay, so if that's the description of the Jesuits in these materials, it makes sense the sources would then focus on a clash with American ideals.
Precisely. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution,
Oh.
these documents are filled with what the sources call Protestant declarations.
And that's supposedly intolerable to the Jesuits.
That's the argument. They even claim the Vatican itself condemned these founding documents. They cite Avro Manhattan, saying the Vatican called the Declaration wickedness.
Wickedness, wow. And the Constitution?
A satanic document, according to Manhattan, as quoted in your sources. So yeah, a fundamental ideological war is being described here.
And then there's the alleged Jesuit oath itself. The sources include excerpts, and they are intense.
Very. They talk about waging relentless war, secret and open, against heretics, Protestants, and liberals.
With the goal being their complete extirpation and extermination.
That's a crap.
Incredibly strong wording. It even mentions horrific violence.
Extremely strong. And it's crucial to note, based on these sources, that heretic basically means anyone who disagrees with the Pope.
So a very wide net.
A very wide net indeed.
The sources even bring in John Adams, a letter he wrote to Jefferson in 1816.
Yes, expressing fear of Jesuit swarms coming to the U.S. in disguise. Adams apparently had very strong negative feelings about the Society of Loyola, based on this letter.
And this idea of blending in, J.A. Wiley's quoted too, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Wiley apparently wrote about their ability to adopt any identity, any belief, any language, to infiltrate any group or church. Supreme adaptability, used for, well, potentially subversive ends, according to this view.
Okay, so this leads us to the core of the conspiracy theory presented here. If this has been going on since 1815, could they be behind major historical events?
That's exactly the question the sources pose. They ask, could they be controlling U.S. policy? Could they be involved in assassinations? Lincoln, McKinley, Garfield, Harrison.
And even more recent things, Waco, Oklahoma City,
Yeah.
9/11.
Yes, those are all raised as potential examples of this alleged hidden hand at work, attacking the Constitution and American freedoms.
And the sources try to link this to specific goals set out way back, Congresses of Vienna, Verona.
And cheery, yes.
Yeah.
The supposed grand objectives being the destruction of Protestantism globally and restoring the Pope's temporal power, his worldly power everywhere.
It's a huge scope. Did anyone else at the time see this coming, according to the materials?
They mentioned George Canning, the British foreign minister back then. He supposedly warned the U.S. government about the intentions of those European monarchies. So maybe some awareness of a threat.
Right. Then the sources zoom in on specific American history, John C. Calhoun.
Yes, a major focus. The assertion is that Calhoun was essentially a Jesuit plant,
A plant, meaning?
placed or influenced to deliberately sow discord, specifically to drive a wedge between the North and South over tariffs, pushing them towards conflict.
Which eventually led to the Civil War.
That's the argument. They even bring in Daniel Webster and John Quincy Adams, suggesting they suspected the tariff issue wasn't the real root cause of the tension.
And they used Charles Chiniquy, the ex-priest, here too.
Yes. Chiniquy's perspective is that Rome intentionally fueled the flames over slavery to weaken both sides, North and South, hoping they'd destroy each other, leaving Rome to pick up the pieces, so to speak.
So the Civil War itself, orchestrated by the Vatican. That's the claim.
That is the claim presented in these sources. And they add an alleged quote from a priest, Phelan, about the Pope's ultimate power over world leaders, implying figures like Calhoun were just following the script.
Andrew Jackson fought Calhoun, and he opposed the central bank idea too.
And the sources connect that directly. They claim his opposition led to a Jesuit-inspired assassination attempt against him.
So a pattern emerges in these texts. Oppose the agenda, face elimination.
That's the pattern they draw. And the central bank issue is presented as absolutely critical to the Jesuit plan.
Nicholas Biddle and the Rothschilds are named.
Yes, as the key agents pushing for it. The Rothschilds are even labeled guardians of the Vatican treasury.
Implying a direct financial link between the Vatican and this push for a central bank.
Exactly. And the sources quote figures like Thomas Jefferson and more modern authors like G. Edward Griffin on the dangers of a private central bank controlling the nation's money.
Portraying the Federal Reserve ultimately as a tool for creating debt and control.
Right. And they recount Biddle's reaction when Jackson vetoed the bank bill, supposedly contracting the money supply, causing economic pain to force Jackson's hand.
Which didn't work then, but the sources say the goal was achieved later.
Yes, with the reestablishment of the central bank in 1913, seen as a major victory for this long-term Jesuit strategy.
Then the sources turned to other presidents. William Henry Harrison died very quickly in office.
The claim is he was poisoned. Arsenic.
Why?
Because he supposedly refused to acknowledge the idea of government by divine right, pushing back against that monarchical principle favored by the Holy Alliance and, allegedly, the Jesuits.
And they have evidence for poisoning.
They cite Senator Thomas Benton remarking on how sudden Harrison's illness was, and they connect it to language in the alleged Jesuit oath about using secret means like poison to eliminate enemies.
Okay. And Zachary Taylor, too, also died in office.
Same claim.
Poisoned.
This time for opposing the expansion of slavery, which the sources equate with opposing the slave power, which they in turn equate with the Jesuits.
It's a recurring theme. They also mention James Buchanan.
Allegedly poisoned around the time of his inauguration, but he survived.
Then we get to Lincoln. This seems like a major focus in the materials.
Huge focus. Charles Chinneky's research is heavily cited. The claim is the assassination plot was hatched in Mary Surratt's boarding house,
And Surratt's place was what?
described in the sources as a known meeting place for priests. The motive given is Lincoln's opposition to Rome's influence and his defense of the Union.
They mention earlier attempts, too, in Baltimore.
Yes, failed attempts, and a supposed letter to John Wilkes Booth ending with, "Abe must die."
And this is all tied back to those European congresses, Vienna, Verona.
Yes, the sources explicitly connect Lincoln's death to the plans laid out by Metternich, the Pope, and the Jesuit order decades earlier. It presented as part of that grand strategy.
What about the other attacks that night?
The attempt on Secretary of State Seward's life is mentioned, plus alleged plans to kill Grant and Vice President Johnson simultaneously. A decapitation strike on the government.
And the conspirators who were caught.
The sources emphasize that the 4 people executed for the conspiracy were all Roman Catholics.
There are also some really striking alleged quotes from Lincoln himself, talking to Chinneky.
Yes, very dramatic ones. Lincoln supposedly told Chinneky he feared the Pope and Jesuits more than the Confederacy itself.
Believing the Vatican was the real force driving the war.
That's what the sources claim Lincoln believed. They even add a story about disguised Jesuits supposedly helping Lee's army escape after Gettysburg.
Wow. Okay, so all of this, the assassinations, the war, it's all framed as part of the long-term Jesuit goal.
Exactly. Destroying the Constitution, American freedoms.
Yeah.
Paving the way for papal supremacy. That's the narrative.
Moving into the 20th century, the Titanic, how does that fit in?
The claim here is astonishing, that the sinking was deliberately arranged by the Jesuits.
Arranged. How? And why?
Through Captain Edward Smith, who they label a Jesuit coadjutor, basically, a lay Jesuit, the motive, to eliminate key wealthy figures who opposed the creation of the Federal Reserve.
Like Guggenheim, Strauss, Astor, they were on board.
Exactly. They're named as the targets. The sources also note the presence of a Jesuit priest, Father Francis Brown, who disembarked before the final voyage.
And the Federal Reserve is established shortly after in 1913.
The timing is presented as significant, linking the disaster to the achievement of that goal.
Then the Fed itself is linked to funding World War I.
Yes, the sources claim the war was desired by Pope Pius X,
Why would he want a war?
allegedly to chastise the Serbians for defying papal authority and also as payback against Germany because Bismarck had previously opposed the Jesuits.
So geopolitical revenge plots funded by the new central bank.
That's the assertion. And overthrowing the Russian Tsar is presented as another Jesuit aim achieved through the War and Revolution.
Who funded the Russian Revolution, according to these sources?
They point to Jacob Schiff of the Kuhn, Loeb & Co. banking firm, calling him the principal Jesuit in America controlling Wall Street.
A Jesuit banker funding the Bolsheviks.
That's the claim. Then comes the aftermath of the war. The League of Nations, seen in these sources as another Jesuit push for world government, orchestrated through figures like Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House.
And the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR.
Same thing, portrayed as a key instrument for Jesuit influence, aiming for global control. They list prominent members alleged to be connected.
And they quote John Swetton about the press being controlled.
Yes, to imply that the media wouldn't report on any of this truthfully.
Okay, let's jump to more recent times. 9/11.
The sources claim this, too, was a Jesuit-orchestrated event.
For what purpose this time?
To create fear and provide justification for eroding American liberties. They cite President George W. Bush pledging to follow the Pope's teachings after the attack,
And the Patriot Act followed quickly.
presented as a pre-planned outcome, enabled by the crisis,
Yeah.
designed to weaken constitutional protections.
And Waco and Oklahoma City are viewed similarly.
Yes, as earlier examples of engineered crises, the Waco siege, the bombing in Oklahoma City, both used, according to these sources, to pass legislation restricting freedoms and to demonize groups seen as resisting federal authority.
They mentioned Bill Clinton's role.
His administration oversaw Waco, and the anti-terrorism laws passed quickly after Oklahoma City under him. It's all presented as part of the same agenda.
And this connects back to the Vatican's historical stance.
Yes, they link it to the papacy's long-standing opposition to liberty of conscience, quoting encyclicals from Pope Pius IX and Avro Manhattan's analysis of the Vatican's negative view of the U.S. Constitution.
So where does this all lead, according to the sources? What's the end game?
The ultimate goal described is essentially religious control. The complete dismantling of the Constitution's protections, particularly freedom of religion, and the imposition of what the sources call the mark of the beast.
And they use the book of Revelation to explain this, chapter 13.
Yes, they interpret Revelation 13 as foretelling Jesuit treachery. The two beasts mentioned are identified as powers, the first rising from the sea, representing populated Europe.
Which they link to the papacy.
Right, citing historical claims about the Pope being like another god on earth as evidence of the blasphemy described in the prophecy.
And the second beast, from the earth.
Representing a power rising in a less populated area interpreted as the Western Hemisphere, specifically the United States, which eventually enforces the agenda of the first beast.
And the mark of the beast. How is that defined?
This is linked directly to the Sabbath issue. The sources argue that the Catholic Church itself points to its change of the day of worship from the seventh-day Sabbath, Saturday to Sunday, as the mark of its ecclesiastical authority.
They quote Catholic sources on this.
Yes, they cite various Catholic catechisms, publications like the Catholic Record, and statements attributed to priests like Thomas Enright and C.F. Thomas, where the Church supposedly claims this change demonstrates its power over Scripture.
So the final stage involves a Sunday law.
That's the predicted culmination. A future crisis, perhaps economic collapse or social chaos, allegedly engineered or exploited by the Jesuits, leading to the government enacting a national Sunday law.
Which would force people to honor Sunday instead of the Sabbath.
Exactly, leading to persecution for those who refuse, based on their conscience, and creating a final global split between those who follow papal tradition, Sunday, and those who follow the Bible commandment, Sabbath. That's the end game laid out in these materials.
Okay, so just to summarize the core argument we've unpacked from your sources, it's this idea of a hidden, centuries-long conspiracy.
Right, driven by the Holy Alliance and mainly executed by the Jesuits, aiming to systematically undermine and ultimately destroy the U.S. Constitution and its freedoms, particularly those rooted in Protestantism.
Using allegedly everything from political intrigue and financial manipulation
To assassinations of presidents, provoking the Civil War, creating the Federal Reserve, even sinking the Titanic.
influencing world wars and orchestrating modern crises like 9/11, Waco, and Oklahoma City, a staggering list of alleged interventions.
All supposedly directed towards one ultimate goal: restoring the Pope's temporal, worldwide power, crushing liberty of conscience, and establishing papal authority, symbolized by Sunday observance becoming law.
It's certainly a comprehensive and alternative narrative of history presented in these documents. It raises a final thought, perhaps. If one were to consider these claims, these historical interpretations, what might the implications be for how we view current events?
Or how we think about that ongoing tension between national security and personal liberty. It definitely gives one a lot to think about.
Indeed. We encourage everyone listening to, look further into these historical claims if they're interested and really weigh the perspectives presented in the sources we discussed today. Food for thought, certainly.